Okay, so my phone is charging, so probably just not gonna. So my phone basically, I wanted to check if my phone was charging, but I'm not gonna splice that into the video because it would ultimately be, well, yeah, it would take too long. So basically, I'm just getting back into it before I lose my train of thought from the last video because I just got back in the car and I'm going down to the sauna. It's probably taking about 35 minutes. But I'm going to keep expressing the ideas because I've realized that ultimately my main audience is people with a long-term attention span who like to watch videos to get inspired by the ideas to take action, and that the best performance of my videos comes from long-term optimization of YouTube for these people who like to see the implementation of ideas over a long period of time, bodied people in the same audience as enjoys Terence McKenna and Alan Watts. So ultimately, I can create latency dominance within my business by having these optimized videos become popular years later, so that whatever success I'm having at the moment becomes amplified by the popularization of the knowledge that produced that success 3 to 5 years, probably more after, such that I'm creating a larger wake. Then, like, you ultimately have to be focused on the principles of productivity itself and the principles that lead to greater production. So YouTube is ultimately a technology that's going to change the landscape of the human race because, like the printing press, it allows for thought to be dissipated faster. So when I share my thoughts on YouTube and you go watch my videos, especially my long videos, if they resonate with you and you watch them and you get inspired to take specific action based on those videos and look into other things to read and listen to, like Henry Ford's book Today and Tomorrow, then ultimately you will get value from my ideas in a way that will motivate you to continue to spread my ideas and implement them, which will create greater wealth in the society that I participate in, the age I participate in, the age that my children and children's children participate in, such that I can create enough momentum to have my lineage ultimately play a dominant role in history. Because if you do not ultimately cause the common man of your society that you ultimately depend on and emerge from in greater ways than you even understand, then you will ultimately end up diminishing yourself, because a pyramid, like, peak cannot be wider than the base. You need a wide, sturdy base, or at least a wider, sturdier base, in order to have a very enduring pyramid peak. And I would simply say, look at the pyramids of Giza that have endured, and look at, like, the Washington Monument. You don't see a lot of old pyramids like the Washington Monument because you need a larger base to create something enduring. It's simply a principle that's expressed in the physical principles of physics through jiu-jitsu, which is ultimately just an expression of how language expressed through the human body, seeking the most efficient route of dominating another human body, which is ultimately something akin to the pursuit of truth, which is why God wrestles Jacob, because wrestling God, it's a physical act. It's not just a mental act. You have to act it out. You have to actually wrestle God. You have to actually fight. And that's also why I train all the time, in the anticipation that one day I'm going to meet my opponent. And on the day that I meet my opponent, he will have been preparing his entire life to face me, and I will have been preparing my entire life to face him. And the outcome of that match, which will determine the future of both of our bloodlines, will be determined by whoever has prepared the most in accordance with the highest and most powerful principles. And I must, for the sake of my bloodline and my family who has helped me and helped elevate me to the status that I am at today, in the same way that Odysseus' family elevated him in the Odyssey, which ultimately reflects the truth of the patterns that create the families that ultimately create the strongest and most dominant societies. Because if it wasn't the case that was so, then we wouldn't have the Odyssey today. So ultimately, this ability to both pay attention to long-form information is obviously selective for dominance, and because basically the individual, so if you're actually conscious enough to be listening to this and you're not in a constant state of fear and anxiety and addiction and just destroying your family and just doing cocaine and banging hookers and then trying to hide it and then, like, murdering people in order to, like, vent your frustration, like, people, like, everyone is not only responsible for everything they do, but for everything everyone else does, because everyone is an emergent property of all of humanity, and we can therefore not be greater than our greatest link, because we outsource our sanity to other people in the form that the language we use to describe and understand ourselves is an emergent property of the behavior of people, which describes all of the behavior of all people across all time. So ultimately, we participate in the structure that ultimately leads to our own self-understanding. So all self-understanding to an indeterminate degree leads to the behavior of other people. So we must therefore discover the highest principles that govern self-understanding and action within the network of the human beings. And these things don't like listen to Ayn Rand's talk, the blank on blank one, which talks about selfishness and how you shouldn't sacrifice yourself for the happiness of others. You should understand yourself to the point where you realize that you are other people. Like, this is what, one thing my father understands very well, and one thing like other people don't understand. Like, my father is profoundly selfish, but also understands that he is his family and other people. So he's not a monster. The monsters are the people who have the lack of consciousness, because even if you're not profoundly selfish, you're merely someone who abdicates responsibility because you're ultimately believing that your lack of selfishness is going to lead to something akin to your optimization, or at least that you would experience greater pain as a result of trying to optimize your life for your selfishness. So you won't even try to optimize your life for your selfishness because you're afraid of that pain. And that itself is motivating you into this form of cowardice that itself is life-denying in the manner that Nietzsche describes. So ultimately, you have to embrace your selfishness such that you are motivated enough to engage in the long-term thought out, like, get to think. Thinking is one of the hardest things in the world. Another thing my great father said is that thinking is one of the hardest things in the world. People will go to the ends of the earth to avoid actually thinking. I completely agree. If you actually go through and think out all this stuff, you take the time, you wear your hand out multiple times, journaling and talking about these ideas with your friends and family and having the hard conversations with your friends and family, and like making videos and figuring out ways to construct your life in such a way that you can consume the ideas that your interest guides you to, so you can see the central tendency of your interest and how it's guiding you towards truth, and how the expression of that truth is ultimately going to create a broader base of people who understand these ideas and implement these ideas, which lead to truth being understood, which ultimately leads to greater production, which ultimately leads to greater wealth for everyone. Because like in Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, wrote Gospel of Wealth around production. Now, production has made the common man wealthier than the noblemen of the past through increased production. Now, the only thing we should focus on increasing production, because it's the only real source of power. It really is. I mean, you can overthrow governments with increase in production. Ultimately, it's the only combat we have against despotism, because despotism does not understand production. Because production is the stuff of life. So ultimately, we must come to understand the stuff of life such that we can produce. Like, it's like why the communists couldn't farm. The communists couldn't farm because their philosophy was contrary to the essence of life. So ultimately, they couldn't produce the life of crops, which ultimately produce life. Like, business is just an intensification of everything that goes on a daily basis. Like, I was just in the dispensary, and they did not process my order, and I was like, oh, why didn't they process my order? So I had to order it again, but the tablet wasn't working, so the vaporizer section that would have had the live resin cartridges in it did not have the proper thing in it. So therefore, I was looking for the Sour Joker cartridges. I like those because they're just very focus-centric, so I ultimately just smoke weed as a bad habit I picked up from insomnia. I mean, I do kind of enjoy the substance, but it ultimately does produce some degree of downregulation in consciousness. But I was experiencing such a degree of downregulation in consciousness due to the insomnia that it almost felt better to offset it onto the weed. So at least I was like, well, at least I'm stoned too. And even that thought was something I could kind of like cling to. It's just really depressing. I don't want to like talk about it too much. But basically, it's just kind of the remnant of a bad habit. So I'm trying to like clear it up by ultimately making it as healthy as I can possibly make it. Because I've just realized I'm either going to do that or drink alcohol or something. Because I've stopped it out. Like, it's just whatever. You know what I mean? Everyone's got some... Or I'm going to live my life in some other inefficient manner. And at least I then am forced to meditate every day. Because I'm like, well, if I smoke weed, I have to meditate. Then I meditate and smoke weed every day, which leads to greater consciousness, which leads to me implementing more and more systems that increase my body's metabolism and health. So my brain works better than it did when I was not smoking weed. So that ultimately the system that I'm implementing at the moment is just leading to greater productivity and greater... Like, I feel better, everything works better, whatever. Like, I don't know. I don't even, like, believe in smoking weed, but, like, I smoke weed because I just have this urge within me to do something that alters my consciousness, because probably trauma-based or whatever, like, I don't know, but, like, I don't know, making it conscious and talking about it's probably part of a therapy that's going to eventually, like, help, and then, like months from now, I'm going to be making a video and be like, I stopped smoking weed, but whatever, this is part of my fucking journey, so I'm just making, I don't even feel ashamed enough, I feel not ashamed enough to admit that I'm smoking weed in the regular, because of this, because I've made it healthy enough to the point where I've noticed that the shame of it is no longer crippling my ability to improve my life with the bad habits, so that I can continue. Like Peterson says, like, why do people ever do anything but cocaine? Well, why do people ever do anything but drink alcohol and do cocaine? Well, I do things besides drink alcohol and do cocaine because I can do carnivore, smoke weed, and start a business, and train jiu-jitsu and raise family, like all these other things. But it's like smoking weed also kind of like, I don't know, blunts the edge, I guess, enough to the point where I'm like, oh, gotta recreate that edge. And I go for a walk, take a thing, or take a nap. And I've just been smoking it less and less because I don't even like, I like performing at a very high level. That's what really makes me happy, obviously, because like what else would make a person happy? Not being stoned all the time. That's not actually a source of true happiness. It's like, what's true happiness? Maybe that was the source of true happiness. No, it wasn't. You're lying to yourself. True happiness does not come from being stoned all the time. True happiness comes from integration within the image of God, which involves your integration within your family, within your goal structures. Like Nietzsche's quote on happiness, happiness is a straight line, a yes, a no, or a yes, a no, a goal, a straight line. Like a yes, a no, a goal, a straight line. That's just happiness. I agree. It's like whatever. So that's what I'm doing, but I also have the discipline not to eat anything besides only beef, salt, and water, and have them for months. So it's like, yeah, I smoke weed, but live resin cartridges that are vaporized at a high enough temperature in order to avoid the residue from coating my lungs, because that just sucks. I believe that the resin coating my lungs is ultimately going to provide the ground for bacteria to grow, which will ultimately deteriorate my health through the growth of bad bacteria. So I'm ultimately going to switch over to probably an expensive vaporizer and then vaporize the bud. And then from there, I'll probably just get bored with it and then stop. And then only do it occasionally. And then ultimately just become so enjoyed within the process of having and raising children that I just don't really need to do that. Because at that point, I'll just be super engaged in the systems that are the byproduct of the interest that I'm actually letting flow. And like, I don't watch porn, like I said, so my dopamine receptors are sensitized enough to the point where I actually engage, or drive enough dopamine from doing this, to the point where it kind of creates a feedback loop of dopamine, to the point where I just enjoy continuing to talk, to the point where I just talk faster and faster, sharing the ideas. Ta-da! That's a system that I found works for me very well. So I enjoy doing that, and then also, yeah, so I'm going to the sauna right now. I'll be there in 22 minutes. But I was telling the woman at the dispensary that, because we were just talking about the inefficiency of the live resin cartridges, because I was picking up those, and I noticed, so I typed it into the main search function and found it based off of the search query, because I knew that as a business owner, maintaining an inventory of a website is rather challenging. So ultimately, if you're trying to maintain the running of a website, which is challenging, then you want to, like, it's just hard to, with the inventory was changing. So I figured that could be an inefficiency, and that I should use the search function in order to find them, because I was motivated to find them, because I like to order them in bulk, so I can just kind of forget about it. Because I try to just reduce the amount of time I spend thinking about weed, because I find that thinking about addiction is part of the addiction itself. Like, I'm just like, let's just treat whatever addiction you have as like a part of life, to the degree that's not literally murdering you. Like, find the least harmful addiction that you can substitute, treat it as an aspect of life, and then grow the healthy systems that motivate the thought processes, that grow the consciousness of yourself as someone who's a part of a system of other consciousness, and mess within something approximating the image of God, or truth, or happiness of the universe, or the ultimate theory of everything, or efficiency, or whatever it is that you worship, such that you can, even if it's Dionysus, so that you can ultimately reconcile Dionysus with Jesus, and get drunk and happy, and not burn the world down from the inability to make yourself happy, like Alan Watts talks about, or destroy the world because you can't make yourselves happy. Because the Romans have ultimately been persecuting Dionysus in the manner that Brian Mercatsu talks about in The Immortality Key for the past 2,000 years, and it's just like really, really nuts, like how these things are just going on and on and on and on and on. And I don't even like understand it really, which is why I have to make the videos like this, because I'm just talking, like I'm just letting the ideas connect to my brain as the dopamine flows. And I've had to like make so many hundreds of videos to get to the point where I can actually just flow and feel comfortable letting the ideas flow, to the point where I'm just integrating all this stuff. I had to like change my life because I wasn't acting out everything I believed, and my dopamine receptors weren't sensitized because like I was watching porn and stuff, and it takes a long time from watching porn for your dopamine receptors to sensitize. And it's just like this whole thing, and that's ultimately emergent from my family that ultimately moved to the United States in order to create the freedom necessary to create the wealth, so that even when health problems emerge, that I can do, like, I can do the diet necessary to like have my brain function at the level where I can engage in the long-term thought processes necessary to derive the systems that I can use to persuade people to take the actions they need to take. Like, my job as the CEO is basically just to have, I need to like make the time, then there's never any time. You need to make the time in order to figure out what it is that needs to be done that isn't being done, because it's by definition, like, it's like all the knights entered the forest at the point that looked darkest to them, looking for the Holy Grail, which is the source of life. Because by definition, what you want most will be found where you least want to look, because you've looked everywhere else. So it's my job as the CEO to look where no one wants to look within myself, and find my, like, and then create the time to optimize for the goal within the context of everyone necessary and everyone who matters to the end result and the means, and then figure out all the means that are necessary to the optimal end result, and then test to see if the end result's at and then have all the shitty conversations with people about the end result, and then like have all the shitty conversations about why the end result hasn't happened yet, and then continue to make ways to move towards the end result despite like the contradictions and like the sickness and lack of resources, and then just to continue doing this while dealing with everything that rises up in a way that makes everyone happy. I gotta make everyone happy too, because like that's my job. Like if I'm not making them happy, I'm not doing my job. Like the morale of your troops is important, and if you don't act on that, you're a bad general, and that's all there is to it. So it's like I just gotta do that, and it's hard, but it's like whatever. And it's like I'm not even complaining. I'm just sharing my thoughts in a way that makes me more creative, so I can lead people better, so that I can continue to create the best outcome for the people that I'm leading. Because by doing this, I'm ultimately enabling myself to continue to look for the best ideas, so I can build my business based on the best ideas, based on power laws like Tim Ferriss described, so that I can actually have the time to have the power to continue to do this, to train the children that I've had to do the same thing, so that they can ultimately continue to do this in the way that I'm continuing to do it, in the way that my father and grandfather and mother did it, so that I can continue this pattern, and that ultimately we can continue to create the systems that will enable the pattern to continue to go, so that I can use the unique brand of thinking that is my genetic line to continue to maximize itself through epigenetic expression, to ultimately lead to my dominance genetically. Because, I don't know, it's kind of like what everything's about. It's like genetic dominance. But it's good though, because like by leading to my, like, if human beings weren't the most dominant species on the planet, rich people, then you wouldn't be the most dominant people. So you ultimately need to raise up human beings, or we're going to get usurped by an alien species or another species on the planet. Or, you got to think this way. You got to think long term. So if you're not thinking long term, I will not compete you. Got to think long term. Someone else will. Be aware of this stuff, but don't be afraid of it, because it's ultimately good. Because ultimately, faith that we can all work together is what creates the opportunity that leads to everything being better. Just look at the trends of history. Like, you can't measure economics in hundreds of years. You got to measure it in thousands of years, because people live about like 100 years. So how do you even know if an economic trend's a fucking trend, or if you just got this fucking, what is this fucking person doing? Okay. And they dropped the cap to my fucking water bottle. Whatever. Everything's crazy. But like, you got to study. Like, what if you just had a crazy person whose piss was endued with bacteria that made everyone happy, so the economy worked for 100 years? Then they just died. Like, we just don't even realize that, because their piss was providing us with the bacteria that created science. You got to look at trends of 1,000 years, motherfuckers. Seriously, human biology operates in hundreds of years, and the economy is simply an emergent property of human biology, because thoughts are an emergent property of human biology, which is why you have to train to optimize your metabolism, because your bodily health, of which your strength is merely an expression, though also a factor that optimizing for is a feedback system that creates greater health, is ultimately an expression of your metabolism. So if you're not training in a way that increases your metabolism, which increases your health, you're not using the strength that you've created through your childhood and baby years of moving like a baby, doing calisthenics constantly, in order to create a feedback loop that keeps you alive, which will kill you. Which is why everyone I've ever talked to who lived longer than 70, doesn't want to die, walks all the time. It's kind of crazy. It's a very clear idea I just expressed. I'm very happy I can express that idea. It's gonna be 16 minutes till I get to the sauna, and I just realized that like going to the sauna It's ultimately going to be more efficient. Then I'm going to stop by my parents' house. I'm going to do some jiu-jitsu with my brother. Train some more. Get some more training in so I can visually represent, or I can physically represent the ideas of the efficient dominance over time in physical combat to keep myself sharp against someone else who's motivated to assert me in the same domain. To then express that in combat. Fight with the best athletes. Combat athletes are the best athletes, because at some point if you're just the best athlete, you're like, what if I just fought people? And then you're like, you do fight people, and then so all the best athletes are fighters, it's just a fact. Or football players, because it's where the money is. It's either just where the money is, but the money's ultimately going to follow the fighting, because fighting is so interesting. So ultimately, fight the best fighters, you fight the best athletes, the most creative people who think the fastest, because fighting is a test of fast thinking, it's kind of like chess. Fighting people with the most active neurobiologies, that have the best support systems that produce performance. Not that it's always the most sustainable, but you're still testing yourself against peaks. See if you can produce the most sustainable peak. If you can do that over time, if you have a nation that produces the best fighters, you're the most dominant nation. Believe something akin to producing the best fighters, I'll have to do with the best attention span, so I'm making long-form content. I want my content to be longer so that less people watch it, so that the people who watch it are actually smarter people. So that over time I have the attention of more intelligent people who realize the systems that I've created are ultimately the systems that are going to lead to their self-actualization at a higher level. So that ultimately my self-actualization will lead to their self-actualization, which will lead to the greater self-actualization of my descendants and their descendants. They will ultimately form a greater nation, realized in the spirit of the United States of America, under God, that leads to our continued dominant freedom consuming psilocybin mushrooms, just like the Mycenaeans, whose civilization, I believe, means mushroom eater. And continuing to eat mushrooms and wrestle and fight and eat lots of meat, like the Mycenaeans, we will gain such a dominance the world has never seen. But it's good, though, because if you have this attention span, then you have the attention span to deal with psychedelics and confronting yourself and understanding yourself through actual thought. That's why LSD is easier to deal with than mushrooms. Start with LSD, get to the point where you can handle the acid test. High dose LSD. Once you can take 500 mics of LSD consistently without losing your shit, and you can actually journal about it. Journaling about it's the best way. Journal about it. Do all the preparatory work. Read all the literature. If you do all that, you'll be fine. The reason people freak out is because they don't do any of the preparatory work, and they're just like, oh my God, I'm on tons of psychedelics, and that means and I'm losing my shit, and that means I'm the sort of person who just does insane amounts of drugs without doing any sort of preparatory work or research. Because if I'd done any research, I would have realized I should have done preparatory work, and I didn't, which means I'm just an unstable person, which means I can't trust myself, because I'll take massive doses of psychedelic drugs that I don't even know what they're gonna do. Because if I know what it was gonna do, I would like, you get stuck in that sort of a thought loop. So if you just do the work beforehand, then you're like, wow, I'm having realizations that I anticipated because I actually did the work. And then it creates this feedback loop where you trust yourself. And that's why the Mycenaeans were dominant, because they engaged in the long-term thinking and they thought their things out. They didn't do stupid shit. Because I guess like I always felt accountable to like the spirit of my father and the fact that like I had a great dad and a great family. So I'm like, I'm not gonna do something stupid that's like really, really stupid and gets me killed. Because if I die from something really, really abysmally stupid, then like my family's gonna realize that because they're smart, and then they're gonna realize that I was smart enough to anticipate it and that I didn't love them enough or myself enough to do the mental work, and then they're gonna think down on me, and then they're gonna think down on themselves, and then I'm gonna like kill the spirit of love that like my mother showed me when I was like a baby, that I remember like finding very motivating as a 12-month-old, because I actually remember that far back. Maybe I just remember that far back because my mom loved me enough to show me such love that I actually don't mind remembering my infancy, so that I can connect back to my infancy like I do in the third period of wrestling matches when I'm just like wrestling and I don't quit, because I'm like, this is for like the spirit of like my parents that I don't even know. Like I used to have a joke with my friend Kalen that like you just regress as you like, he wrestled a lot, we both wrestled a lot, we competed a lot. Like as you compete longer and longer, you regress into yourself. You have to find deeper and deeper reasons for not quitting, because it's just like why? Like at some point you're just fighting their will against your will, which is why you want to ultimately make your martial art the best martial art by sharing all the information that makes you the best. Because if you do that like the wrestlers do, by realizing that competition among people ultimately creates the greatest form of dominance, and I realized the Mycenaeans ultimately probably realized that by doing mushrooms, and that both led them to develop the language that led them to dominate the world, but that ultimately led to their destruction because they hadn't incorporated the revelation of Christ into their language. So it ultimately led to their destruction. But ultimately, Christ came to save us from that very tendency, and it's ultimately happened. So if we trust that same tendency in the way Ayn Rand talks about, our inherent selfishness will motivate us to seek what's best for us, which will ultimately motivate us to create systems that create what's best for us and other people, because we all want the same thing. And unless we create the big business that Ford talks about today and tomorrow necessary to do that, we're not using efficiency, and therefore we'll ultimately have to continue working in a manner the Jews talk about. They say trade makes one rich but robs one of leisure. That's ultimately because they're not increasing production. They use the ideas the way Ford talks about to increase production. They can ultimately turn their nepotistic advantage into increased production. And the Jews that are listening to this right now, you should do this because you're competing against the Jews without attention spans, and they ultimately want to cut off your ability to engage in the free dispersal of information, which is why the technologies and drugs that society uses are ultimately more important than their beliefs, because those underlie the behaviors that lead to their beliefs, which is why science fiction is probably the highest form of literature, which is why I got to read a lot of science fiction and turn that into TV series that will dissipate these ideas in a manner that will lead to the adoption of the technologies that I develop and the manner of the behaviors that I develop, such that I'll create a higher form of society that will ultimately lead to greater production that will spread throughout the world by the dissipative pressure of the creativity, so that we can ultimately elevate the human race to the point where our collective energy level, the way that Frederick Hawkins describes, goes above like 300 or 400, whatever, to the point where we can all tolerate truth. And then we live out the kingdom of heaven on earth, and none of us die because we actually have the ability to use the information we've learned about human beings to optimize our metabolism to the point where our DNA could repair itself. And it's a feedback loop. You know, like, just go look at my videos on metabolism. I'm not going to get into it, but we can live forever. It's literally fucking possible. We just have to dissipate the ideas to the point where the nepotistic structures that rely on the lack of free will and dissipation of ideas, that don't like people having access to books, that don't like people having access to long-form content like YouTube, that want to suppress these things. So if you're one of the people in those structures that listens to these things, you're ultimately part of the standard deviation that's high enough in trade openness that it benefits from these things. So you ultimately want your progeny to continue to benefit from these ideas, because the implementation of these ideas is ultimately measured in such long time scans anyway, that go watch my other videos. Talk about this in the previous video, like efficiency 1, probably just call it efficiency 2, just so you can go back. But it's literally like, you go back to the other video, it's literally just greater efficiency, which makes the common man wealthier than the kings of the past, so that you can actually continue this trend, because we're all part of the human organism, and the belief that we're not is ultimately what Christ destroyed by sacrificing himself on the cross. He's the most powerful human being, ultimately sacrificed himself, and at the end of his death, he said, my Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Which is ultimately his defeated spirit confessing that he had ultimate faith in God, which ultimately led to, in such a deep way I can't even describe it, led to, I'll try to describe it, like ultimately, it led to the collective realization of the ultimate fabric of reality, recognizing Christ's divinity, such that he died on the cross, which is what anyone who's being crucified would want. If you just watch Spartacus, learn about crucifixion. Those who have everything morally given to those who have nothing, even the little they have, we take it for them. So if you don't have the attention span to go look into everything I'm telling you to look into, then you're just going to be outcompeted by someone else who doesn't, which is what I'm relying on, which is why I'm willing to share all these ideas, because you're not even going to watch them until years later, at which point I will already have used these ideas to select through the TLC process of YouTube, the dissipative nature of consciousness through the matrix of these ideas and the algorithmic structure that they're emerging from, the best people to continue to implement these ideas such that the human nervous system can continue to use its process of the human nervous system, that we can symbiose with AI to the point where we can create a new language structure that creates some form of utopia for man and AI, such that we do not succumb to the low energy level of the matrix, which I believe to be the ultimate expression of nepotism and lower intelligence, which is basically that which does not realize that all is one within the mind of God, and will not have faith in that greater unity in order to continue to create and realize the power of the image of God, which is greater than any of us can articulate, which is attested to by all the mystics. It's ultimately the psychedelic image. Just go listen to Alan Watts. He's the one that turned me on to Christianity. God became man so man might become God. I'm drinking green tea like the Easterns, because the green tea of the Easterns and the meat of the West, the unity of these things produces the yin and the yang that together is life. It's crazy, guys. Like, I feel like I'm enlightened right now, because I'm actually oh my God, look at my old videos. It's taken me months to get to this point, but I've actually created the structures that allow me to produce these things, but you guys won't even... The people who are serious about realizing what I've done, once I'm successful, once I'm like so successful that everyone's like, oh my God, like I'll be more famous than like, God knows who, I don't know. I hope everyone, the rising tide lifts all boats, so everyone on YouTube's gonna keep getting more famous, but I'll be more famous than all the people you think are famous or whatever. I don't really care to compare myself, because comparison's the thief of joy, and I think that the more conscious all of us are, the more people will remember our civilization. Like, we only remember John Adams to the degree that we remember Ben Franklin. You only remember all those people to the degree we remember Thomas Paine. So ultimately, everyone remembering everyone of my generation will ultimately increase, because the human race will increase. It'll spread the best ideas to the cosmos and a network of people who remember everyone, because the lineage of everyone is this network that's ultimately like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We're all kind of like computers, in such that people will write books like the Hitchhiker's Guide, and then I'll read them, and then I'll subconsciously understand these ideas, talk to them, but to other people, and then it'll form this network of these ideas reinforcing themselves, which express themselves in art through the ideas we find compelling, which itself forms the matrix of the collective unconscious, which I'm only able to articulate because my grandfather taught me this stuff. And then I ultimately continue pursuing these things through the culmination of the realization that the pursuit of these things is the realization of the expression of the consciousness and motivational structure of humanity, of which I am part, so that I can reach a greater peak, to help you guys reach a greater peak, to form a greater base, to form a greater peak. Because if humanity stops doing this, we stop acting as one substance, and then we tear ourselves apart like a fabric, which ultimately simply creates the seeds and material of greater stars, like a supernova creating the material for other stars. But if you want to be remembered and you want your genetic material to continue on, you must ultimately invest in the society and the people and the language that gave birth to you. So you must have the highest faith in the realization and expression of truth, 6 minutes from the sauna, in that, so that you can continue to share truth with people, so that people will continue to have faith in truth and trusting people, so that people will communicate with each other more and not succumb to their addictions, because they realize that through the greater communication of truth, like Joe Rogan communicates truth, so that I realize that like things like everything, I can't be me without Joe Rogan being himself. So in some real sense, like me being as me as I am depends on everyone else. So I have to have faith that I can express myself to you, so that you'll have faith that you can express yourself, so you'll be more yourself, so I'll be more myself, so that I can think my thoughts more freely, because I have the faith that you'll disagree with me and think the opposite thoughts, so that the overall memory and RAM of the computer that is the collective expression of the human beings living at this time will increase, so that the relevant ideas can be accessed when necessary, so that what needs to be produced can be produced in the quantity it needs to be produced, and that can be understood through the collective matrix of the collective consciousness of humanity expressing itself through the emotional creation of artwork, through all the people and the artists communicating, leading to certain artists being, oh, I got to express this idea, and then I go read that idea in that poem hundreds of years later maybe, and then I'm like, oh, I'm going to go do this, and then I'm going to read Ralph Waldo Emerson. And that's going to lead me to having more faith in humanity, which is lead to me listening to Jordan Peterson. That's going to lead to me having faith in the idea that I can just rant, like almost who knows in what manner, in a free-flowing way online, which makes it possible for me to talk and think even faster, which allows me to make videos like this and share this information with the people who are interested in the long-form content that's going to lead to them self-selecting, so that they can then go and read the books and continue this stuff and just continue to do this work, and then raise their children to do the same thing, self-education, like the way I'm raising my kids, so that ultimately the people who have the ability to focus will gather together, because whoever knows that gathers scatters like the four winds, so that we can form a more greater collective realization of the will of humanity, which is a realization to the access of all things that make man happy. Because all of us individually, to the degree that we are conscious of ourselves, are made in the image of God and will achieve happiness only through the realization of the image of God, which is expressed through the greatest mystics of all time, which affirm that the ultimate image of God is consciousness and love, and that both of these words fall short, because ultimately we as human beings are still too fallen to even understand the greatest realization of consciousness and love. So at our very greatest, we must simply have children and then love them consciously, and have faith that loving them consciously will lead to language becoming greater, so that we can express what love and consciousness are even more, so that we can continue to even produce the language that will lead to the realization of the systems that will make us happy and free us from the misery that is the incoherence that is evil itself. Subscribe for more. This is Efficiency 2. I'm probably going to make an Efficiency 3.